Okay, let's get going. So let's see. It's a great pleasure to introduce Stephen Wolfram. Josh wrote a very nice introduction, so I'm going to read that as part of it. He said, summarizing Stephen Wolfram's career is like summarizing War and Peace. Yeah. So with apologies to Stephen and anybody else, Stephen Wolfram is a computer scientist, physicist, and entrepreneur who has profoundly impacted computational science and mathematics. Stephen earned his PhD in theoretical physics from Caltech and became the youngest recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. He founded Wolfram Research and created Mathematica, a comprehensive software system that revolutionized mathematical computation. He also developed a computational knowledge engine, Wolfram Alpha, which answers queries using curated data and computational algorithms. His theoretical work, A New Kind of Science in 2002, was a remarkable comprehensive study of cellular automata and computational systems that proposed computation as a fundamental framework for understanding natural phenomena. So I'm delighted to have you here. Please share with us whatever you'd like.
Thanks. Okay, actually, I was projecting on screen, yeah. So you just sent me a video of some Xenobots, and I thought I would try and use Wolfram language and see what we can do in processing video frames and tracking elements in this video. I don't know exactly what it's going to do here. It's, I threw it at an AI here, so we'll see what happens. But let me. I'm at best an amateur biologist. I guess back in the 1980s, I studied a lot some systems called cellular automata. I was originally, long ago, I was a physicist, got interested in kind of how complex things managed to happen in the world, and started studying kind of, tried to at first use kind of mathematical type models for that, realized that wasn't going to work, started thinking about other kinds of ways to model things, and ended up thinking a lot about how simple programs behave and how those can be used as models of things. And probably, look at this, it's almost finished, so let's just see what it does. Okay, it made a whole thing that thinks it's tracked 273 frames in this video. Let's see. Now I have to remember how to use this. Let's take a look. So this is just generic Wolfram language stuff. Actually, video tracking was a thing that just got added in the most recent version. Let's see. I have two screens here, so I have to figure out where each one is. All right, let's look at video tracking. Let's see what we can ask it about this. Let's see. Okay, we can ask. Let's just ask it to highlight. This is a distraction here to whatever I'm actually going to talk about, so maybe I shouldn't do this right now. But let's say highlight video. Let us take that video tracking object, which is a nice symbolic representation of what it generated, and say video and that thing, and see what it does. It might make a video with something highlighted. Let's see. Okay, so let's try running this. Now, what is it highlighted? Oh, I see. Okay, I need to tell it to highlight. It's highlighting big chunks of this, so it's not knowing that it should highlight individual cells, for example. I thought we're trying to solve the problem of how to understand when these things tumble, and I think we might be able to just say, let's just take one of these frames, and let's just say here, image key points, like that. Let's just see. Okay, so those are key points that it found in that image. Let's just see where those are. Let's say let's plot. Let's just say. I'm going to stop. Let's just see where those were. Okay, I wonder whether those correspond to the cells. We can find that out. Let's not do this right now. Let's talk about basic science, and then you have me for a very limited amount of time to try and do real-time live coding and so on. And maybe I'll try to do some of that. But let me come back to talking about basic science. So the sort of question that I was interested in long ago, how do complex things manage to happen in the world? I started thinking about using programs as a way to make models of things. And so a type of program that I got very interested in a cellular automata. That's the typical rules for a cellular automaton. You have a line of cells that are each either black or white. Then this specifies what the color of the cell on the next step should be. So if we just make a picture of what this does, if I just say, if I just take that, and I started off from one black cell at the beginning, run it for 40 steps or something, that's the result we get. So very simple rule, very simple behavior. If we change this rule, we'll get different behavior. For example, here's another rule, and here's the behavior that that gives. And keep that running a little bit longer. It'll make a very intricate pattern, very simple rule, but very intricate pattern. So my original assumption back in 1982 or so was if you had a sufficiently simple rule, then even if the behavior was somehow intricate, it would still be somehow fundamentally simple. You'd be easily able to say what would happen after a long time. So then I tried a little experiment. This is sort of a typical experiment in the computational universe of just seeing what all possible programs of a certain kind do. So let's say, let's just do this. Let's make there 256 programs of the type that I showed at the top there. Let's just see what all of them do. Oops, that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. So this is the result. And much of the time, simple program, simple behavior. But then comes my all-time favorite science discovery. This is rule 30 in the sequence of rules that we have here. And if we run it, let's look at what the rule was. It's just this here. If we run this, we'll get a pattern like this. So there's some regularities in this pattern, but for most practical purposes, this pattern seems very complicated. The center column is for all practical purposes random. So I was pretty excited about this back in 1984 or so. I was it seemed to me it was kind of showing us a little bit the secret of how nature manages to make complicated things. Out in the computational universe, even very simple programs can produce very complicated behavior. So there are many things one can say about this. One of the phenomena that I started talking about back in 1984 was a phenomenon I call computational irreducibility. So you can ask the question, what does it take to predict what's going to happen in this system? So the standard from traditional science is all about making predictions of things. If we're making mathematical equations, we just write down some formula for the answer. We can figure out what that formula implies at any time in the future. But what turns out to happen in systems like these is a different kind of thing. This, in effect, the making of this pattern is sort of the doing of a computation. If we wanted to kind of figure out what will happen in the future, we somehow have to have a reduced computation. This has to be somehow computationally reducible. But what happens is that this is not computationally reducible. It's something where, yes, we can figure out what will happen by just following each step, but we can't expect to jump ahead and see what happens by any more efficient procedure. So this is kind of, at first, this seems like sort of a limitation on science, that there are things we can't expect to predict other than by effectively just observing them or explicitly simulating them. But computational irreducibility turns out to have many, many implications in, in proof of work for cryptocurrencies, or in AI ethics, or in understanding, as it turns out now, things about the fundamental theory of physics. But back in 1985, I decided I would apply these kinds of things to biology, and in particular to biological evolution. Actually, at the time, this was mid-1980s when theoretical biology was having one of its upticks. I think because the web didn't exist and because I was writing papers about things called cellular automata, I got invited to lots of the theoretical biology conferences. So that was sort of a data point for me at that time. But anyway, 1985, I said, well, what happens if I just look at rules like this and I start looking at sort of mutations of these rules in the same way that you might think about mutations of a genome, what happens? I didn't find anything interesting. I came back to that question last year, and I did find something interesting, which I want to show you. So just what I did, sorry, it's hard to find the mouse here. But That sounds like some biology experiment. It's hard to find a mouse. Never mind. All right. So this is just a simple cellular automaton. Happens to have 3 colors rather than 2 colors. And the rule for it is over on the left. And the behavior of the system, the sort of development of the thing, is over on the right. And so you can think of the thing on the left as being a very simple, idealized genome, and the thing on the right as being a very simple, idealized phenotype. And so then the question is, well, what happens in a system like this if we mutate the genotype? So let's say we do single point mutations on that genotype, and we ask to, we progressively change this genotype. We keep on trying different genotypes, and we say what happens. Let's say that we are trying to make a pattern that lives as long as possible, but not an infinite time. Every red dot here represents one attempt, one new genotype, and then the consequence for how long the thing lives. And what we see is that most of the time, most of the red dots are sort of things that are down ticks from where the system got to so far. But every so often there's a sort of breakthrough that happens, and the system kind of jumps up to living longer. And if we look at this sequence, so this is kind of a meta model of kind of biological evolution. It's a thing where we're seeing kind of a succession of discoveries that get made by evolution. And let me show you kind of the sequence here. These are kind of the sequence of kind of breakthrough configurations in that evolution process. The thing I find kind of interesting is as you do different, by the way, do people understand how this model works? Yes? Yes. It's so I mean, these are a few different sort of rolls of the dice for different sequences of rules that we get. And what I find kind of interesting is typically you see the thing develops an idea, like it makes these kinds of funny shaped triangles or something, and then in successive breakthroughs, it builds on that idea to make it to do something that is more successful. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what you might see in the fossil record or something of sort of different lineages of organisms that manage to come up with different ideas for how to be fit, so to speak. Well, this model is simple enough that you can actually go and look at kind of the graph of all possible mutations. So this is a slightly simpler case with just 2 colors. You start off from kind of the null rule at the top, and this is showing sort of all possible paths of biological evolution. And so you can think, over on one side, there's one branch in the tree of life, over on the other side, another branch. And it's successively, it's giving us kind of as we go down the page, so to speak, we are getting fitter and fitter organisms, so to speak. So one thing we can then think about, there are many directions to go here, but one thing we can think about is to look at sort of all possible mutations between these kinds of organisms. And what we realize is that this is a bigger example of slightly larger organisms, so to speak. What we can ask is, if we have the kind of graph of all possible mutations, what does the fitness function do to this? Effectively, what it does is it defines kind of what it means for time to progress. It defines, in sort of physics terms or mathematics terms, it defines a foliation. In physics terms, it might define a sequence of space-like hypersurfaces kind of going down in time. It says which of the various things that can be reached by mutation is considered to be the thing that is fitter. And so the picture then is sort of a fitness function imposes this kind of way of layering this graph of all possible mutations. So one of the sort of basic questions here is kind of why does biological evolution work? And if we just look, let's see a picture of this. If we just look at the successive kind of breakthrough points in one of these systems, what those radial plots are showing is each direction is a possible mutation in the genome. And what this is showing is what the radius is showing how successful that mutation would be. and the red lines show the mutation that was actually picked from this sequence of rolls of the dice. So one question is, why doesn't the thing get stuck? How can it manage to explore this space in a reasonable way? And turns out this phenomenon of computational irreducibility that I mentioned earlier is the reason that this is capable of sort of exploring the space. Computational irreducibility effectively gives you kind of enough randomness that it is very likely that the thing will kind of escape that there won't be any kind of structured minimum in this fitness function, structured maximum in this fitness function that it won't be able to escape. And so actually you can actually start drawing fitness landscapes. It's fun that you can actually draw these, because usually people talk about fitness landscapes but never actually have a chance to draw it. It's a little bit complicated because really it's in a high dimensional space, but you can actually start seeing kind of how these evolution processes kind of walk around the fitness landscape. But the question you can ask, so I mean there are lots of questions you can ask about sort of what's going on in the system and sort of what is biological evolution really doing. One of the questions will be, is it discovering mechanisms that we can then talk about? Well, I think the answer is not really. I mean, here are a bunch of particular rules that happen to live a long time. And if we say, what is a kind of explanation of why one of these rules lives a long time, a few of them, maybe there's some kind of narrative explanation we could give. But in most cases, this is just sort of a story of computational irreducibility. The thing just lives the time it's going to live, and then it dies out. And that's pretty much all you can say about it. I mean, I should have said, I started looking at this in 1985 and then came back to it last year. The thing that made me come back to it was knowing that machine learning works, which I hadn't known back in 1985. I had played with machine learning back at that time, also hadn't really managed to make it work in an interesting way. The main thing you learn from machine learning is that sort of if you bash the system hard enough, it will succeed in doing things like learning. Well, in this case, what turned out to be necessary was just bashing the system a bit harder to get it to actually be able to evolve sort of fitter organisms. But the picture that sort of emerges is there's what's happening in this biological system is kind of a piece of computational irreducibility. You can kind of take one of these pictures and feed it to an LLM and say, write a description of this picture in the style of a biology textbook, and you get things that are sort of shockingly similar to the kinds of things you see in biology textbooks. You can start describing, oh, it has this, you can give it names to all these little structures that go in this way or that way. I think this is kind of what is fundamentally happening in biology, and I think the reason biology kind of works, biological evolution works, is that there is irreducible computation going on in what happens in the actual development of organisms, and there is this sort of a supply of irreducible computation there, yet the fitness functions that are imposed are very computationally weak compared to what is computationally available to the organism, so to speak. And, it's not too surprising if you said, if we had organisms that were trying to evolve to solve some complicated math problem, the organisms probably wouldn't be able to do that. It makes perfect sense, I think, that the thing works because the fitness function is quite coarse. Actually, that idea of kind of let me just mention something about, we can take that whole idea of the sort of the interplay between underlying computational irreducibility and sort of computationally bounded observation, computationally bounded sampling of that computation is something that shows up in a lot of places. And I think, for example, something I've studied for many years is the second law of thermodynamics. Where sort of the basic idea is you start off with a configuration of molecules that are quite orderly, and over time they get more disordered and apparently random. You can kind of simplify the whole thing. You can eventually make something which has discrete cells and all that kind of thing. You can eventually get it all the way down to being like a cellular automaton, where you started off with sort of an orderly arrangement of things, and then kind of over the course of time, it gets ground down into something that looks much more random. So why does the second law work? The second law works because in that sort of grinding down process, it's sort of an irreducible process of computation, We could, in principle, if we knew all the bits here, we could reverse that process of computation. But in practice, our sort of observations that we make of systems are computationally very bounded, and the result is that we can't sort of outrun the irreducible computation that happened in the underlying dynamics of the system. So the second law of thermodynamics turns out to be another example of kind of the interplay between our computational boundedness as observers in that case and the computational irreducibility of the underlying system. Turns out the same thing also, and this is something I absolutely did not see coming but discovered about 5 years ago, is the same thing is true of both general relativity and quantum mechanics. They're both related to sort of the interplay between underlying computational irreducibility and our characteristics as observers. It's something I absolutely did not see coming, that would be able to derive general relativity and quantum mechanics from our nature as observers. From a biology point of view, we can kind of think of this as being sort of the environment. The fitness function is kind of the observer that is sampling particular possibilities in this collection in this sort of computationally irreducible set of possibilities. So, and it turns out the same basic idea applies to machine learning. So in machine learning, we might have some little neural net that's like you feed in an input, it has a bunch of weights, generates an output. This has been trained to evaluate that function I showed on the right there. You can go and try and simplify the system, you can make a grid out of it and so on. Eventually you can get it down to the point where you have discrete, you have sort of a grid of discrete elements that correspond to sort of a very idealized, very minimalized collection of weights in a very idealized kind of meta model of a neural network. So, and in this case what's happening is the different colored cells run different rules. So, so then you can ask, well, can you train the system just like you train a neural net? You can do that by essentially just, the simplest way is just to mutate the cells that appear at particular space-time positions. In this case, I was training it to just have any pattern live for 50 steps and then die out. So it succeeds in doing that. You can draw kind of a fitness curve or an upside-down loss curve, seeing sort of the successive breakthroughs that got made in kind of the training of that system. You can kind of roll the dice a bunch of different times. You see the same kind of phenomenon again. What you're seeing is that these are different ways that the machine learning system could have learnt to live for 50 steps and then die out. I think the thing that's interesting about this is a few of these ways we can kind of mechanistically explain what's going on. Most of them we cannot. Most of them, it's the same story as in biological evolution. It's kind of a lump of irreducible computation that happens to do the thing you want. So kind of the picture that's emerged for me of machine learning is that you kind of, if you're trying to achieve an objective, like you're trying to build a wall, you could achieve that objective by having bricks that you just have nice shapes and you build them up in a bricklayer pattern. But you can also do something different. You can just look around on the ground and see a bunch of rocks lying around and try and build a stone wall where the rocks fit in whatever pattern they fit in. I think that second thing is kind of what's happening in machine learning. I think it's also what's happening in biology, that there's kind of this selection of lumps of irreducible computation that you get to use and build up for the particular purpose you want. And it's sort of because the purposes you have are very computationally weak relative to these sort of lumps of irreducible computation. That's why it's possible to have both machine learning and biological evolution work. Well, there are lots of things one can study. I'm happy people probably might have a bunch of questions about these models of biological evolution. I've investigated them a certain amount. There's much more to investigate because I just discovered that these things can work about roughly a year ago now. Here's an example of an application. This is to medicine. I hadn't really imagined that there could be sort of a formal underlying theory of medicine, but you can kind of imagine how you might make such a thing up. And here's the basic idea. So you imagine that you have an evolved system, some system that was evolved for some purpose, in this case to just live a decent number of steps and then die out. Now, you can also say, well, what happens if you perturb that system, if you poke it in some way? Well, it probably won't do as well. In this case, it dies out after a much smaller number of steps. And then you can think of sort of the computational formulation of the fundamental problem of medicine is to figure out what additional interventions do you have to give in order to make the thing go back to something more like its healthy state. So you can start studying this with some, fairly systematically. You can study what happens with all these different perturbations. You can study kind of what the changes of the lifetime curves are for all these things. You can start studying things like here's an example of kind of just a feature space plot of sort of what all the diseased versions of things look like. So this is kind of like a map of all possible diseases for these very simple systems. And it's kind of interesting because it shows you, in human diseases, we've got some classification of 100,000 of these things. And this is kind of showing both that there are islands of sort of somewhat distinct diseases and then these kind of continua of things between them. But then you can start studying things like what happens when you make different kinds of perturbations, how much information do you need about the system to be able to figure out anything about how to perturb it. This is about genetic variation. This is about how perturbations work differently in different genetic variants of this particular system. It was something that got evolved to live a decent time and then die. But some of the elements in its sort of tiny genome didn't affect its normal development, but they do affect it if it gets perturbed. So that's just another example of sort of the same general kind of thinking. I might just mention, I'm just going to load you up on various things that I've worked on recently that might be relevant to what you guys care about, and I'll show you a few things that might be relevant. So I'm going to turn to a slightly different thing. One of the things that I was showing was this graph of all possible mutations. We call those things multi-way graphs. They really came up in a big way in our physics project because they turn out to be the core thing that gives one quantum mechanics. But in this application, they have nothing to do with quantum mechanics. This is just an application of the same formalism. You can apply sort of the same. You can sort of apply the same formalism in lots and lots of places. Like, for example, let's say we're doing games and we have a simplified tic-tac-toe game which can have multiple moves that are made. We can build up one of these multi-way graphs to show all the different possible moves that can get made, and eventually we can make a tic-tac-toe as a good example. Here's a good example. Sort of that's the game graph for tic-tac-toe showing who wins, who loses. This is an example of one of these multi-way graphs. Another example that might be relevant to the things that you guys are thinking about is is the following thing. Imagine that you have a sort of a single idealized cell, not one of your kinds of cells, but just an idealized cell, and you're just randomly adding on cells around that cell. So if you keep doing that for a while, one typical instance of what you would get will be something like this, but you can make a multi-way graph that shows all possible ways that cells could get added on to that system. And you can build up this multi-way graph and see what can happen in a system like this. If you change the if you change the rules and don't say you just can aggregate a cell onto any position, but say, for example, that you can aggregate a cell only when there are, I forget what this is, I think maybe exactly 3 neighbors to that cell, you'll get a more complicated multi-way graph, a more complicated sort of set of possible lineages of what can happen in this system. And here, that's a typical kind of structure that you might get from that. What's perhaps interesting to analyze is you can really start seeing, what are the possible configurations that you can get. This is a case where the thing gets stuck. It gets to a configuration where you can no longer add another cell on. That's actually pretty rare in the multi-way graph of all possible things that can happen. The place where it gets stuck is rare. I might say, by the way, in the whole sort of general model for biological evolution that was making, there are one of the things that one sees is, often the system will live for a finite time and then die out. There are a few long-lived examples, but sometimes you'll make a change and the system will end up living forever. It will, and usually and it will grow forever. It's kind of like what one might imagine tumor cells are doing in actual biology. Kind of if the program is slightly wrong, it will not be a program that keeps a finite size. It will be a program that grows forever. And you can kind of look at so that's another kind of direction to look at things. I'll mention one other thing that I looked at recently. This is kind of a story of the comparison between what can be engineered by us humans and what kind of can be generated by exhaustively searching possibilities, by sort of just going out into the computational universe and finding what's there, or by doing sort of adaptive evolution. So I've never been a big fan of the game of life cellular automaton, mostly because people get extremely confused about sort of the idea that there could be complex behavior from simple rules, and then they'll show a picture of a little glider in the game of life and they'll say this is an example of complex behavior, which it certainly isn't. But the game of life is pretty typical cellular automaton. It happens to be a two-dimensional cellular automaton. This is a three-dimensional picture of what it does. The behavior is very similar to the kinds of behavior that we saw, very organic looking as well, similar to the kinds of behavior we saw in a bunch of those evolved cellular automata. But one of the things one can ask is, of this, in the system, there are things which were constructed by people, and there's now kind of a 60-year history of people building all kinds of funky things in the game of life. They can build, let's see, I've got a good example here. That's a complicated configuration that was constructed by humans in the game of life. And these are all sorts of things that have various kinds of specifically constructed behavior. And so one of the things that is of interest, perhaps, is to see what's the trade-off in things that have been discovered. What's the pattern of kind of human engineering done in the system? It's a very clean case because, if you're studying the semiconductor industry or something, you have to ask, was gallium arsenide important in the semiconductor industry or some other thing that relates to actual sort of physical objects? Here we're just looking at patterns of bits and asking what did people discover in patterns of bits. So what tends to happen is there is some things are constructed, some things are searched for. We can see sort of comparisons between things that were, let's see, let me get a good example. We can see things that were found, let's see, I've got an example I think here. Those are kind of oscillators. Those are things that have a certain period. This is the period up the y-axis, and then the year of discovery on the x-axis. And as we've gone on through time, more and more of these oscillators have been discovered. Some of them have been discovered by constructing them. You can kind of guess by looking at them which ones were found by construction and which ones were just found by pure search. So that one there is kind of one found by pure search. These ones which have a lot more structure, sort of visible structure, were ones that were found by construction. So it's sort of interesting to look at what can you kind of tell what was going on. One good test is the sort of level of modularity of the patterns that you get. Humans tend to make things which are, humans tend to make patterns that have lots of modular parts that are sort of part of a narrative that we can understand. Exhaustive search tends to make things that are much more sort of all pieces fit together in their unique way. So it's an interesting question to what extent, so this sort of contrasts. On the left, there's an example that was made by human construction. On the right, one that was found by exhaustive search. You can ask the question, does it matter, how does sort of what's found by exhaustive search compare to what is found by doing adaptive evolution? I have a few examples of that, but I'm not sure that I can completely characterize the difference between those two. But it's sort of an interesting thing when you look at biology, and you look at, I think, what you're trying to do with sort of constructed biology. There's kind of the trade-off between the things you can construct and the things that you can find by various kinds of searches. So, I've been trying to think about more questions about sort of the foundations of biology, because it was sort of kind of encouraged by the progress we've made in fundamental physics. Actually, the same set of ideas, strangely enough, which applied to fundamental physics, also tell one a bunch of things about the foundations of mathematics, and have ended up being useful in these other places as well. But so in biology, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is kind of what kind of a thing is biological matter? I mean, one might have said in the past, oh, it's just like a liquid with a bunch of molecules bouncing around, you know, it's just chemistry. But it's become clear in molecular biology in the last few decades that that's really not the right picture. The right picture seems to be much more when you have big molecules, it's much more a story of how these molecules kind of in an orchestrated way interact with each other. Even at the level of chemistry, there is sort of a sub-chemistry that one has to think about. I mean, in ordinary chemistry, you typically say, well, the rate of some reaction is proportional to the concentration of the reactants and so on. But that's only a good model if those reactants are randomly bumping into each other. It's the same as the kind of SIR models of epidemiology and so on. It assumes that everybody's just running into strangers all the time. But that's probably not what's actually going on, particularly with big molecules. With big molecules, probably the thing that's happening is much more that it matters that there was sort of an interaction between molecules A and B, specific molecules A and B, and those same specific molecules sometime in the future. So, for example, what we get to make is more of a kind of, what starts to matter in kind of subchemistry is what we can think of as a causal graph of interactions between molecules. So here's an example. This is just a space-time picture of a kind of Newton's cradle collection of molecules where one hits the next and hits the next and so on. And the yellow dots on the right are the interaction events. And so we can just sort of pull out, well, this is a hard sphere gas. Actually, just like the second law of thermodynamics examples that I showed you earlier, this is showing the causal graph of interactions between those individual hard spheres. And so one can imagine trying to sort of build a subchemistry that looks not just at sort of random interactions between molecules, but these causal graphs of interactions between molecules. I don't yet know the implications of this, but it's something which has quite a lot of interesting kind of structure, and it may be a way of kind of teasing out something about sort of what happens in chemistry, rather what happens in biology rather than in pure chemistry. But I think more than that, the story of biology seems to be at a molecular scale sort of a story of bulk orchestration. I mean, you have all of these different mechanisms and they're all kind of interacting to do the things that the biological organism does. And I think kind of the problem is sort of analogous to what can you say in bulk about a system that has this kind of orchestrated behavior? You might say, well, you know, it's like a microprocessor, where a microprocessor has some kind of orchestrated behavior. And if you were sort of doing basic physics, you might say, let's model a microprocessor as a gas of electrons in a semiconductor. This would be a pretty bad model of a microprocessor. The question is, how can we do better? How can we make a bulk model of sort of an orchestrated system? I don't yet know the answer to this, but we've been making very recently a little bit of progress in this direction. The thing is, in statistical mechanics and studying things like the second law of thermodynamics, one of the big ideas is this idea of an ensemble. The idea that you can look at a whole collection of different possible states of the system, for example, coming from different initial conditions for where the molecules are and so on, and you can say, what's the average behavior across this whole ensemble? And it's a pretty good approximation to say that this ensemble kind of samples equally all the possible initial configurations of the molecules. So the question is, well, what happens in biology? Is it the case in biology, the one thing we seem to know is that some fitness function was applied to the kinds of behaviors we get. There's a whole collection of different possible rules, different possible genomes, different possible patterns we could get. But the one thing we seem to know about these things is that some kind of fitness function was applied. So it seems to be the case. So there's this kind of other ensemble you can make, an ensemble of different rules. And kind of the speculation is that if you just put sort of the constraint of there is some fitness function that's been applied to these things, that there will be a way to make bulk statements about what happens. So that there'll be a way to kind of talk about what happens in any kind of bulk orchestrated system that has a fitness function applied to it. So that's kind of a coming attraction of my attempt to sort of, if we can make such a theory, then we have the beginnings of sort of something that can help us as a sort of foundational theory of biology. I mean, biology in general has been a field that hasn't really believed in theory. And, the natural selection is one kind of theory that has had a very hard time having sort of a good sort of foundational way to understand what it's really doing and why it works. I think now with this whole story of computational irreducibility and its interaction with fitness functions, I think we finally have a pretty good sort of quantitative, explicit way of understanding why natural selection works and what it's really doing. But when it comes to sort of the structure of biological organisms, we don't have the same kinds of theories that we have in areas like physics and so on. And it's, the intuition from physics that simple models tend to work is absolutely wrong in biology, where it seems like there's always a footnote to a footnote to a footnote about how things actually work in biological systems. You say, it works like this, and they say, except in this case, and so on. I think that's partly a reflection of the story of computational irreducibility. That's partly, that's a thing where sort of that tower of footnotes is kind of a reflection of that same kind of phenomenon. I mean, it's directly the same kind of thing, that you can't get kind of a large-scale narrative explanation. So another sort of meta question about theories of biology is, can there be a theory of biology? It's not obvious that there could be. If it's sort of computational irreducibility all the way down, it might not be possible to have a theory of biology. It might be that the only thing you can do is just run the system and see what happens. Here's the good news about that. Any time there is a system that has computational irreducibility, it's an inevitable fact that there are an infinite number of pockets of reducibility within that system. There are certain features of the system that you can say things about it. Like, here's my favorite rule 30. Over on the left-hand side, there are these kind of periodic stripes. There are these white triangles that have a particular form and so on. Those are little pockets of reducibility in this otherwise computationally irreducible system. And by the way, those kinds of pockets of reducibility are pretty important for us as entities in the universe, so to speak, because what happens in the structure of space-time and so on, which I wasn't going to talk about unless people want to hear about that, but what ends up happening in our models of physics, kind of the underlying structure of things are these networks that kind of eventually grow up to define sort of the structure of space-time. Here, I'll show you just one picture, maybe. I was going to show you one video, perhaps. Well, never mind. This is the basic point. I should show you one video. Okay, so this is in our model of physics. This is kind of the a very sort of the one version of the beginning of the universe. Where space is represented by this network, and it gradually gets rewritten. The actual form of what we're seeing here is just for our human eyes, so to speak. All that really matters to the universe is the connectivity of these elements in this network. But the kind of thing we can look at is sort of much later in the history of the universe. This is a pair of little tiny black holes. And what you see here is kind of the structure of space formed from this network, continually changing, and these black holes will eventually merge and they'll produce little gravitational waves. And it's all pretty interesting from a physics point of view. But the question is, for us as kind of observers of the physical universe, how come we're not stuck down at the level of sort of this irreducible computation, all these very complicated things going on in the structure of space-time? The answer is that we are kind of looking at a slice of the system. We're looking at a slice of what happens that sort of plugs into a pocket of computational reducibility. The reason that we have laws of physics that we can talk about that are sort of succinct enough for us to have them as kind of narratives that fit in our sort of finite minds, the reason that's possible is because we're kind of plugging into pockets of computational reducibility in this otherwise computationally irreducible system. It turns out the pockets of computational reducibility that we find in these systems in physics correspond to the big physics laws that were discovered in the 20th century, for example. And that's kind of that's where those come from. And it's also the fact that we can sort of exist as coherent entities in the physical universe is a consequence of the fact that there are these pockets of computational reducibility that we can plug into. What are the pockets of computational reducibility in biology like? We don't know. I don't know, at least. That's kind of the challenge, is to find, are there kind of laws, fundamental laws of biology that are useful to us? For example, it could be the case that, in a machine learning system, for example, in fact, maybe we know one example of this, there are laws about what happens as you go through the layers in an LLM or something. There are pretty robust laws about that. But what that means for sort of the actual operation of the system, we don't know. It's kind of like measuring EEG from a brain and saying, what does that mean about what the person is thinking type thing. It's there's reducibility at the level of having this kind of collective effect, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the things we want to know. So it's a thing I'm curious about, is sort of what are the questions that we would like to answer foundationally in biology. And I think we have sort of the beginnings of what I see these little cellular automaton models and things as being is kind of meta models of biology. They're not specifically models of any particular system in biology, but they're models that capture sort of the computational essence, I think, of what's going on in its biological systems. And there are zillions of questions one can ask about sort of how modularity gets developed and what kinds of modularity get developed, what it means for these systems to die, all sorts of interesting things like that. But I thought so that's a few things that I've been thinking about recently that might relate to biology. I think from a practical point of view, I mean, I see that my day job is running a tech company that makes this thing called Wolfram language and Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, and kind of the mission there, as far as I'm concerned, is to take the things that one takes sort of the world as it is and try and sort of formalize it in computational terms. It's kind of like the original idea of human language was presumably to do that, also logic, also later mathematical notation, and kind of our goal is to sort of make a notation for computation that lets one kind of think about computational X for all X. And it's nice now that there are not only human users of our tech, but also lots of AI users of our tech as sort of a tool to kind of goes in a different direction from the things that LLMs and so on can do well. But the result of that, for people who are interested, there's lots of kinds of capabilities for certain corners of biology and chemistry and so on, and also things like I don't know. Let's make, since I didn't manage to make that Xenobot do anything interesting here, maybe we can at least take, what can we do with that thing? We could take, there's a picture of it, and oops, let's take one of these pictures, and what can we do with this? Let's do, actually, I'm kind of, let's just do, let's edge detect that picture or something. But probably more interestingly, let's do the following. That's very boring. Let's do the following. Let's make a simulated a meta Xenobot. Let's just have a let's just make let's do this. Okay, and let's say let's do something like that. There's our simulated Xenobot, and perhaps we could try and I was talking about seeing how we would detect tumbling of this. We could perhaps, well, let me not, maybe we have different things to talk about. I could try and do a little live coding exercise and see if I can actually make a little machine learning system that will recognize different orientations of this object. I think it will not be too difficult to do that, but it'll take a few minutes, but please.
So, I would be interested in that, like for our work, but have you done any thinking about the link between computational irreducibility and this idea of synergistic information from information theory, like the idea that there's like an XOR gate is sort of irreducible in the sense that you need both inputs to specify the output, but no subset of inputs will? Like they seem like they've got to be very closely related somehow.
Only a little bit. I mean, so for example, the thing you're talking about is a very kind of junior form of computational irreducibility. So to give you an example, let's say we take XOR, as you mentioned, and let's say we take XOR of a bunch of arguments, okay? Then what you're saying, I think, one of the things you're saying is if you take that XOR and we say, Boolean minimize that XOR, I think by default it will turn it into, a collection of ands and ors. Mm-hmm. And so for XOR, let's actually do it. Let's say we say XOR, let's say a sub I goes up to n, and so that's going to make an XOR in a table of Boolean minimize, and let's table of that. N goes from let's say 1 to, let's see, how far do I dare to go, 6 or something. And now I can say something like length of each of these. So that's showing that the length of the minimum. Let me make it bigger. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, my eyes are not great.
There you go. Okay, so that's saying, that's minimizing. So this is saying write XOR of ABCD as a collection of ors of ands. Okay. So this is then showing that we can. I just made a table of successively longer XOR sequences, and I'm just showing here that they indeed grow exponentially, right? So now you could ask a question like, let's say we have the rule 30 cellular automaton. So rule 30, let's do this. We can say Boolean function, I think defaults to 2, defaults to 3 variables. So now we can say Boolean minimize of that Boolean function, and then this will be the one step of rule 30. That's its, I just give it this one, C, for example. That's a representation of the rule 30 rule. Oh, what did I do? Sorry. That's the representation of what function of the 3 inputs is the output from rule 30. Mm-hmm. Okay? So now what you could do is you say, well, let's run more than one step of rule 30. Let's see what happens to the Boolean function that you get out. So let's see if I can do that. Think how to do that. Yeah, okay. So I would have to run, so let's say I say cellular automaton 30, and I'm going to apply that to each of the tuples. It's going to work. Let's say I apply it to these tuples. Actually, what I want to do here is this, 2 steps. This is going to take me a moment to do, but let me say what the result will be. So you can imagine building up the Boolean function that represents n steps of this evolution, and then you can ask, how much can you crush that Boolean function? Mm-hmm. Okay, and the answer is, with sort of purely in the world of for example, disjunctive normal form Boolean functions, they get very big very quickly, and that's kind of a symptom of computational irreducibility. But that's only a very minimal model of computation. This model of computation here is just saying represent everything as a Boolean expression in disjunctive normal form. That's very weak compared to something like a Turing machine.
So let's take the weakness, for granted. One of the reasons that might be interesting is I don't know if we could find, if we have the tools to identify computational irreducibility in its full form in biology, but we've gotten very good at identifying synergistic interactions in data. And so I'm wondering if we could use synergy as maybe a...
What does synergy mean? I'm sorry.
It's information that, let's say you have multiple sources, and then a target, right? You can compute the neutral information of the joint state of the inputs onto the target.
Yeah.
That information is synergistic, if you cannot get the same information about the target out of any subset of the sources. And so that's probably weaker than, you know, computational irreducibility, but it's computable, very easily computable. And so I'm wondering if
yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think. I'm sure I must have studied that at some point in the last 40-something years that I've been looking at these kinds of systems. But let me think what you're saying. What you're saying is, yeah, let me show you an example.
I can also shoot you an email. I don't want to monopolize too much of your
time. Well, here, I'll just show one example here. Let us pull up. Yeah, I'll show you an example. Conveniently, a lot of what I knew, at least up until 2002, is contained in one book. And yeah, so I think this is kind of about when you are trying to reconstruct the output here.
Yes, lots of links to cryptography or synergistic.
Yeah, right. So this is rule 30, and this is asking, given this output bit, this is asking which initial bits do you, no, I'm sorry, this is asking, no, this is a slightly different question, but this is a related question. This is how much input is needed to generate how can you determine the inputs from this sequence here? Which is, and so I think this is going to be equivalent to what you're asking about how much of the input is needed to determine the value of the bit that comes out at the end. Yeah. And so I think this picture probably is that. And by the way, while I'm at it, I could show you. Let's see. I think I might be able to show you. What happens with Boolean expressions. So that's rule 30, and that's after one step. That's the minimal Boolean expression. After 2 steps, 3 steps, and so on. So you see, kind of in terms of Boolean expressions, the thing gets big quickly, and that's kind of a symptom of the same phenomenon. Right. But I don't think it depends on every bit is not. I mean, there are very simple systems that are very XOR-like, where the output depends on every bit. But I think, it's an interesting question, easy to look at. It's a pity our annual summer school just finished, and that's the type of thing people do as a project at our summer school, but I have to wait for next year for that to get done there. Please.
I have a question that is actually secretly very similar to Thomas's, but from such a different perspective, it's going to sound different. You made a quick reference to modularity in your talk. I'm interested how you see an extension of your work in cellular automata from the perspective of Mike's work, or at least I would quickly describe it as in the sense that a cell is a machine with broad functionality that can be used to build more machines. So you get this emergent structure. Have you worked on that? How do you think about those interplaying with your cellular automata?
I don't know much about the hierarchy of things getting built. Okay, I think that in these systems, in these evolved systems, you see a bunch of hierarchy being generated, but it isn't perfect hierarchy. It's only approximate hierarchy, and I don't really know. It's an interesting question how to sort of formulate thinking about that, and I don't know the answer at this point. I mean, what you can see in like that Game of Life example, where people have built things up by hand, so to speak, there is much modularity in what got built by hand. There is very little modularity in what got found by exhaustive search. In other words, exhaustive search will find these things which achieve a function, but in this very entangled way that isn't sort of put these pieces together as building blocks. So, and the question is, to what extent, and again, not fully studied, to what extent is adaptive evolution intermediate between those things? It seems that it's somehow intermediate between the just do an exhaustive search, everything gets entangled together, intertwined together, and the human build these, put these Lego blocks together. Yeah.
Comment on your, you had mentioned that the fundamental laws of physics are in some ways linked to the pockets of computational reducibility in a much vaster space. And similarly, some of the pockets of computational reducibility in the automata made me think that there's a commonality between the two, which is symmetry and or conserved quantities. Like in physics, it's certainly the case that all of the underlying principles of physics can be derived from a symmetry group or set of conserved quantities?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe? Okay.
I don't think that's I think that's a little bit of a red herring. I think that's more in the eye of the way that we describe things is redundant. And so we say there's a symmetry. Because actually our description, like in general relativity, for example, we have general coordinate invariance. But that's because the real thing that matters is something that is sort of below the level of coordinates. When we put coordinates on something, we're making a whole bunch of arbitrary choices, and then we say, well, there's freedom in those coordinates. So it's a little bit more complicated but it is the question of what whenever we see computational reducibility, that means we can jump ahead. We can recognize regularities. We can compress things. And sometimes that compression, very common kinds of compression are things like it's a repetitive behavior. And we can just say, we know what's going to happen because we just follow how many cycles it is, so to speak. Or it's nested behavior. We can kind of look at how all the pieces fit together. And there are a few other examples. Repetition and nesting are by far the most prominent. And so, I think I'm operating in one of this, I don't really know how this comes out type stories. About sort of what might be the right regularities to look for in biology. I might mention just a thing that long ago I did study quite a bit morphogenesis in biology, and let's see. Oops, that's the wrong chapter. How come I can't see the wrong chapter? So I was interested in. One of my favorites, and this is actually perhaps interesting for these purposes, I was interested in mollusk shells. And so I was trying to make models of mollusk shells. And one of the questions is, how much is the form of a mollusk shell determined by constraints, by fitness, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Well, that's kind of the array of possible mollusk shell shapes in a very simple model of the growth of these things. That's an array of actual mollusks, and they fill out the complete space. It was kind of amusing when I got these pictures years ago. I went to see a curator of mollusks at a big natural history museum and said, do you have mollusks that are each of these shapes? And every mollusk he got out of his drawer, he said, it is this shape because, and then gave an explanation about how it wedges itself in the rocks by being pointy or some such other thing. And it was kind of really quite striking that by the end of the afternoon, we'd covered every box in this array. In other words, it's not, the story that it is this shape because it achieves that purpose is probably not the right story. But I looked at a whole bunch of other features of biological morphogenesis. I suppose there's one here that this is a very straightforward one of that perhaps is related to sheets of tissue and so on. And I looked at I was looking at leaves and plant leaves and so on. I didn't manage to figure out too much about. I started looking years ago, this is 30 years ago, at kind of folding patterns in biological organisms and things like that might be more relevant to what you guys are talking about. Yes?
As a vector maybe towards the modularity question, have you ever thought about multi-cellular systems where you have different, what if you take the point of view that each one of these individually is more like an element, and the patterns you can see are crystal growth, but what happens if you put multiple together? You get even more complex behavior functions.
Yeah, so perhaps interesting to look at is, I was kind of wondering in embryology, one kind of imagines there's some sort of grammar of things that can happen, and what can you make from that grammar? And actually, that's a good example. That if we look at that form of if we look at those tiling systems, let me show you some examples here. So this is the right thing. So you can do that kind of tiling thing. Those are squares, right? And you can do the same thing with triangles, and that's the multi-way graph of triangle tessellations. Gets a little bit more elaborate. That's the multi-way graph for hexagons, and then somewhere here I have pentagons, which make much more elaborate kinds of things. So, for example, this is an aggregate made of pentagons, and so that's that's another kind of, it's just a different set of, that's a random aggregate made of pentagons. But there's certain kinds of forms you can get, given the sort of matching rules for pentagons. You can kind of go on, let's see, this is, you can get, this is a more elaborate case. This is the case where you're going to be growing a non-periodic tiling. That's, these have become quite famous recently. You eventually grow structures like this, but you can see kind of how there are sort of all possible configurations. What kind of shapes can you grow? So it's an interesting question is if you put sort of, these are cases where you have sort of constraints on growth. You can also say, if I have a pattern and I want to put certain constraints on the pattern as a whole, what kinds of forms can you get if there is an overall constraint on the pattern? So for example, if you look at something like, let me show you. So here's a case where we're looking at sort of cells where we just make the constraint, but there's no rule of growth. It's just there's a constraint that says around every cell here, around every black cell, there must be 3 white cells and 1 black cell, etc. Then you're forced to get a pattern like this. And so you can kind of ask, well, what types of, so these are, given that the neighborhood has to be like this, given that then what kinds of, this sort of, how constraints imply sort of structure. And one of the things, let's see, I think I have one picture of what happens in, this was the furthest I managed to get back in this is the early 1990s. With that, with this set of constraints, this sort of, if you had a critter where locally it had to satisfy these constraints, the only pattern that satisfies those constraints is this nested pattern here. And so one of the things one can imagine I've been looking for, I haven't found in the last 30 years, and I've occasionally looked for this, is kind of systems where there are simple constraints, but the only patterns that satisfy those constraints are very complicated patterns. So here's, for example, with that rather complicated set of constraints, you're forced to have this kind of Rule 30-like pattern. But in any case, I mean, my feeling is that there's a lot of interesting things one could figure out if one knew what the kind of underlying primitive operations of embryology are, so to speak. There's a lot one could figure out about what it's possible to build with that. What it's possible to build by sort of exhaustive search, what it's possible to build by kind of adaptive evolution. And it's worth realizing, I could show you some pictures I looked at, for example, you can look at the comparison between exhaustive search and this adaptive evolution process, and you don't find everything by adaptive evolution that you find with exhaustive search. I think I might have a picture of that. Let's see if I can show you where one actually gets to with exhaustive search. Well, anyway, there's sort of a limit to what you can get to that way relative to what's possible, so to speak. Whether I can immediately pull up a picture of that. That's a okay. That's kind of a exhaustive picture of the width versus height for certain kinds of critters. So you see the things that there's a curious sort of megafauna-like creature down at the bottom there, I mean it's So some of these, as you do actual processes of evolution with a certain fitness function, you'll reach some of these, but not others. Other questions or comments?
Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, thank you so much. Let's take about 5 minutes, and then we'll set you up with the writing exercise.